Good morning, Bonjour, Minogigejev. Thank you all so very much for attending this session. As you probably can tell, I am not physically there with you all in Salt Lake City, and I apologize for that. I really want to thank our session chair, Dr. Caddy, for allowing me to record this video, record my talk, and present to you all. And so my name is Dr. Niiyokamigaabaw Deondre Smiles. I am a citizen of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and am an incoming assistant professor of Indigenous Studies at Bemidji State University, which is located on Ojibwe territories in north central Minnesota. As I said, I apologize that I can't be there with you all in Salt Lake City in person, but my spouse and I are in the midst of a cross-continental move from the west coast of Canada to northern Minnesota. And so that ended up taking up a lot more time than I had planned and meant that I couldn't make the trip out to Utah. But I hope that you're all having a really great time. So my talk today is called Lessons from Indigenous Resistance for Ecologists. And I will give you a bit of a heads up that this is a bit of a deceptive title for the talk because I really am not going to talk that much about Indigenous resistance. As a matter of fact, I'll take some time to kind of point out why resistance is a bit of a dangerous framing for how we approach environmental change, climate change, anthropogenic change. But instead, I want to try to, in the limited time that I have, impart some lessons and some thoughts about how Indigenous communities approach ecological justice and what we can learn from communities and our more than human relatives, such as the beaver, about how we can approach climate change and move forward in a good way as a species, as humanity. So I will start off by pointing out the obvious, which is that we are in the middle of yet another anthropogenic crisis. For those of you that are located in Eastern North America, I apologize for our smoke that has been coming across the US-Canadian border down into the US. We are in the midst of yet another wildfire season in Canada. And this one is a bit of a doozy. We're seeing fires spreading across Western Canada, such as in BC and in the Northwest Territories, as well as Eastern Canada, such as the northern part of Ontario. Obviously, you're feeling the impacts in the US with poor air quality. In Canada, we're dealing with bad air quality too, and the fact that entire communities, including many First Nations and Métis communities, many of these communities are literally being burned off of the face of the earth by these out of control wildfires. And as you probably are quite familiar with, the literature and analysis, social analysis, environmental analysis shows that these fires are becoming more powerful, driven by increasing temperatures, drought, and the poor land management that has led to the conditions necessary to create huge out of control wildfires. I'm reminded of a couple of good friends of mine, such as Don Hankins in California, Melinda Adams at the University of Kansas, and others who do work on cultural burning. And they would point out and they would say, well, indigenous fire regimes did not result in out of control fires such as this. Fire is not a bad thing, but we have to use it in a responsible manner. But an out of control wildfire is about the furthest thing from responsible fire management as you possibly could ask for. So we see this, we see, of course, increasing temperatures worldwide, droughts, heat waves, people becoming extremely physically harmed, if not killed, from increasing temperatures. And we see that we are in a crisis. And so this leads to a number of key questions that face us as scholars, as environmental scientists, as ecologists. Among the many, many questions that I could spend hours talking about are the ones that are maybe of particular interest to me, including, well, how do we adapt to changing environmental factors when mitigation is no longer possible? We know that when we talk about climate change, environmental change, we oftentimes couch it in terms of adaptation and mitigation as far as human responses. Mitigation being the ways that we can stop effects from taking root, and adaptation meaning how do we learn to live with these effects? And we are rapidly, with increasing speed, hurtling into a environment where mitigation may no longer be possible, right? Well, how do we adapt? How do we learn to live with increasing climate change? How do we learn to live with different climatic patterns? How do we live with glacial melt leading to uh, rising water levels with rivers and lakes and streams that leads to increased sea levels? How do we contend with the pressures of capitalism, nationalism, and development and reconcile them with sustainability, which is a huge struggle, particularly up here in Canada, where we have seen increased national sentiment about how Canada can create economic independence from the United States. And the government in Ottawa seems to think that the way to do so is to build pipelines, to create more mines, and to cut down more trees, and to do things that are environmentally destructive. But they'll say when the argument is made, hey, these things are harmful, they'll say, well, we have to do these sorts of things in order to unlock Canada's economic potential, right? And so how do we reconcile these things? How do we deal with the pressures of capitalism and reconcile with sustainability? I personally don't know that we can do this, right? But that is kind of a key question, is how do we think about development and sustainability? And probably the biggest question that faces us all, right? Can we make a difference? I would dare say most of you in the audience would say, yeah, we can definitely make a difference. That's why we do what we do. But I ask myself that question quite often, right? Is what I'm doing actually making a measurable difference for Indigenous communities, including my own? Now I want to pivot to the way that Indigenous responses to climate change have often been covered in the literature and in broader socio-cultural commentary. And so there have been a couple of terms that have become synonymous with Indigenous environmental action. And those terms are resilience and resistance. And so when we talk about resilience, the capacity for communities to withstand certain kinds of pressure, and in the context of environmental studies, oftentimes resilience is couched in climate resilience. Can communities protect themselves against rising sea levels, more powerful storms, droughts? As a matter of fact, resilience has become one of the most common words that gets applied to Indigenous communities, communities in the global South, including in Africa, Asia, South America, the Pacific. And it's something now that people view being resilient as a badge of honor, right? That they view communities that are resilient, such as this picture here of a community in the island nation of Kiribati, taking actions to protect themselves against more powerful tropical typhoons in the Pacific Ocean and sea level rise. People hold that up as like, see what good work these communities are doing to protect themselves. But speaking as an Indigenous person, resilience is exhausting when you are constantly pushed up to the brink and asked to hold fast and not let yourself get swept over the edge into the abyss. Figuratively speaking, it is exhausting and it is tiring. Myself as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous scholar, I don't want to have to be resilient all the time. I would rather just be able to live life by the teachings and by the ways of relating to the land that my ancestors have handed down to me. And so resilient, I say we should push back against that kind of framing. Resistance is another one, that when we start to view direct action by Indigenous communities, by marginalized communities, as being a default action for these communities, when people say, oh yeah, well, if you don't like what's going on, go out and protest, right? Go out and directly face off against the police or militarize private security, or these companies that are building mines and cutting down trees and building pipelines. This is also exhausting. People get thrown in jail. People can get killed for this. And it also risks pathologizing our relations to land when people just immediately view Indigenous peoples as being prone to just this violent resistance and pushing back with direct action. It starts to really distort the ways that we relate to land and that we think about how to take robust action in this anthropogenic hellscape that we are rapidly being pushed into. And so let me give just a couple of quick examples here. That's the other kind of thing about this talk, is that I could talk about this probably for hours at a time, right? But we only have a few minutes here. And so I'll give probably one of the most notable examples, which is the protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which occurred back in 2016, 2017. On the lands of the Standing Rock Nation in North Dakota and on off-reservation ceded territories. And people, when they think about Indigenous resistance, they think about this as being kind of the stereotypical kind of blue ribbon sort of example, right? Indigenous land protectors and water protectors facing off against the police and people coming and almost kind of this pathologized, kind of like mysticized affect of, these strong, resilient Indigenous peoples pushing back. So this is obviously one example of climate action, right? Of environmental action. There is a place for direct action. I'm not saying that there isn't, right? But people focus on this and they don't focus on the everyday ways that Indigenous peoples engage with the land in generative, in positive ways, right? So here's somebody with their wild rice knockers going through a body of water and harvesting monomen, wild rice. This is also an effective form of environmental action, of climate action. It's not as flashy as a huge protest. It doesn't have cool slogans and heart-stopping contestations between protesters and the National Guard. But this is also something that helps create positive land relations. This is something that helps us to understand the stakes that we are pushing for when we take robust environmental action. And so, what does this look like? What does it look like in order to start pushing back against mere framings of resilience and resistance, and instead taking a more holistic view of climate action? Well, first of all, it will look like the rejection of pathologization and fetishization of Indigenous relations to land and lifeways. I just said a mouthful here, so let me dig in a little bit deeper here. So, Indigenous relationships to environment are complex and multifaceted. As you can see from the very stereotypical picture on the right-hand side here, people sometimes pathologize Indigenous peoples as being one with the environment, that we are intimately connected with the environment in these very stereotypical, very Hollywood-esque ways, where people think we're talking to trees and to the animals, and that we can we can commune with with nature spirits and all of this really new age kind of stuff that is really kind of quite harmful, right? Indigenous peoples, we live in a modern society. Some communities may participate in ecologically damaging activities while some may not. Speaking from Vancouver Island, where I currently live, we've seen this with the Fairy Creek protests recently, where there were two sides within the Pachidat Nation, where one was pro-logging and led by the local elected band government, whereas the hereditary chiefs at Pachidat pushed back against logging. And some people said, well, the elected band government are selling out. But I caution people when they kind of provided this framing, because I said, we have to keep in mind, the impacts of colonization, the impacts of capitalism, economic marginalization, where communities, Indigenous communities, are oftentimes forced to participate in these economies in order to be able to survive. And so I push back and kind of say, well, Indigenous peoples, we do ecologically harmful things too. A lot of times we may not, but we have to take us as human beings and not view us as kind of this fetishized part of the environment. It's a refutation of what I call the ecological Indian trope, that relations to the environment should not be taken as a romanticized connection to the environment. Another thing is a recognition of the effectiveness of quotidian climate and ecological actions. And so sometimes the most effective thing is not the flashiest. Sometimes the most effective climate and ecological actions don't come through direct adversarial action, but rather through community-based initiatives. And so when we see things such as tribal members and Indigenous community members going out and exercising treaty rights, doing on-the-land learning, focusing on cultural revitalization of environmental relations and environmental connections, these are very effective ways of maintaining our relations to the land in a positive manner and pushing back against harmful uses of the land. And they can be just as effective as a protest, if not more so, because the state, when I say the state, I mean the Canadian state, the American state, and individual provincial governments, state governments, the RCMP, the National Guard, they know how to deal with a protest. They know how to easily curtail a protest. They don't often know how to deal with Indigenous communities that are just doing the things that we would normally be doing anyways. And I urge a movement from resistance to resurgence. And so this resistance framing, again, it risks perpetually placing our communities into a state of aggression and defiance, and the state can then use that to repress us and further erode our rights. Instead, I urge us to think about resurgence, right? Think about forward future thinking and centering our actions around strengthening our sovereignty and building good land relations for future generations, thinking about the people to come instead of thinking about facing off against the state in a showy, very spectacular way, thinking about, well, what are the everyday ways that we can still relate to the environment and create meaningful climate action and ecological sustainability in a longer lasting way. So on the very first slide, I had a picture of Amik, the beaver, and now I want to return to the beaver because I feel like Amik is a great example of the type of action that I'm thinking through, right? Where when the beaver builds its lodge, when the beaver builds its dam, it's very slow, methodical work, but the beaver keeps at it. It's industrious. It takes its time, but we can see that when it builds its dams, when it builds its lodges, it starts to, when it blocks the flow of water, it creates more biodiversity around it, right? People oftentimes say that the presence of beavers in an environment in an ecosystem is a sign of of strong biodiversity-based health, and that beavers can create new ecological possibilities just through the work that they're already doing. For me, in my own students and the own work that I do, I view the beaver as a strong relative and a strong example to emulate, right? Where we're not about the flashy actions. If we get a chance to do cool things that get us in the news or get us journal articles or gets us some kind of academic clout, that's fine, right? But rather, I'm thinking about, well, how can I make it so that future generations of Ojibwe at Leech Lake, right, the children that are being born and the children that are yet to be born, can be able to relate to the environment in the same way that I and my fellow Ojibwe are able to do here in the current day. So I want to close with a couple of recommendations because the talk is called, lessons from resistance for ecologists, and I already debunked the resistance part, but you might be thinking, okay, so as somebody who's in the ecology field, what can I do, right? Well, one of the things is in your own research, when you're working with your own community or working with Indigenous communities, any community, slow and steady work, right? Just like the beaver, make sure that the work that you're doing is sustainable over the long term. Prioritize community connections and let the community take the lead. One of the biggest things in academia, sometimes people come into a community and think, oh, well, I have all the ideas because I'm a PhD. Well, you might learn something from the people that have been living in close relation with that environment for generations. And again, sometimes the most effective action isn't the flashiest, right? But it can still do transformative work and work with future generations in mind. Think about the way that your work is going to create new possibilities and build the resurgence for future generations to come. I think through all of this, right, you're still resisting. You're still resisting against frameworks of capitalism and colonialism and poor land relations, but I dare say you're doing so in a sustainable way that will pay dividends down the road. Well, folks, I thank you for listening to my talk. Here's my contact information. Since I'm not physically present in the room to answer questions, feel free to email me. Here's my email address here, deondre.smiles@bemidji-state.edu. You can also read more about me and the work that I do at deondresmiles.com. And you can learn more about my research group, the Geographies of Indigenous Futures Collaboratory, at giflab.org. Thanks all very much, and I hope that you have a good rest of your conference. Miigwech, and thank you for your time.